The roar of the engines echoed across the open road, the wind whipping through the air as riders, clad in leather jackets, raced toward an unknown destination. But this ride was unlike any other. It wasn't just about the thrill of the ride or the power of the bikes. It was about something much bigger. Something that would bring together two groups of people, separated by years of history, prejudice, and division, into one unified force. It was a ride that no one expected, a journey that defied the odds, and one that would go down in history as the moment that brought black and white bikers together in a bond that could never be broken. Imagine this: two worlds, once so far apart, colliding in a single moment. The world of black bikers, who had long carved out their own space in the motorcycle culture, and the world of white bikers, whose own traditions were rooted in a very different set of experiences. The tension between these two groups had simmered for decades, each side unaware of the common ground they might share. For years, these groups had ridden their separate paths, held together by the love of the open road, but divided by the weight of history and the divisions of race and culture. But all of that was about to change. What started as a simple, seemingly innocent motorcycle ride would evolve into an extraordinary journey that none of them could have ever anticipated. The spark for this historic ride was lit when a small group of riders, both black and white, decided to join forces for a cross-country trip. What began as just another road trip soon transformed into something much greater, a moment of unity that would forever alter the motorcycle culture. These riders, who had never shared a single thought beyond their own circle, suddenly found themselves on the same team, riding side by side. The streets they traveled were the same, but the way they saw them was radically different. Along the way, they were faced with challenges that tested their trust in each other, their ability to see beyond their own biases, and their commitment to something bigger than themselves. As they fought the elements, overcame obstacles, and shared the experience of being on the road together, something began to change. The deep divides that had kept them apart began to fade. Conversations, once difficult and filled with hesitation, became easier. They laughed, they shared stories, and slowly but surely, they began to understand one another in ways they never had before. It was as though the road had a way of breaking down the walls they had built between themselves. Each mile they covered brought them closer, not just to their destination, but to each other. But it wasn't always easy. Along the way, they faced tensions that threatened to derail everything. Old wounds, long-held prejudices, and mistrust reared their ugly heads, testing the resolve of the riders. It became clear that the ride would not only be about physical endurance, but emotional strength as well. How much could they really let go of? Could they truly unite, or would the divisions of the past be too powerful to overcome? In the midst of it all, one rider stood out. Marcus, a seasoned black biker who had seen it all and experienced the harsh realities of racial division within the biking community. His deep scars, both emotional and physical, were a constant reminder of the battles he had fought, both on and off the road. His initial skepticism about the ride, and about trusting riders who had always been on the other side, was hard to shake. He wasn't sure he could forgive the years of exclusion and judgment he had endured. But there was something about this ride, something that told him it was worth a shot. Then there was Jake, a white biker who had grown up in a world where his friends, his family, and his fellow riders shared a very different perspective. He had never questioned the way things were. But as the ride progressed, Jake found himself grappling with his own biases and fears. The bond that was forming between him and the other riders began to challenge everything he had believed. Could he truly be part of something that defied the norms he had always known? Could he set aside the prejudices that had been passed down through generations? As the miles stretched on, the bonds between these riders grew stronger, but so did the tension. It was as if the universe was daring them to see if they could really make it all the way. Could this ride truly be the catalyst for a change that would last beyond just the road? Could it transform not only their lives, but the lives of everyone who would hear their story? As the riders neared their final destination, a place known for its rich history in the biker community, the anticipation grew. What would happen when they arrived? Would the divide that had kept them apart for so long resurface? Or would they be able to finally cross that line, leaving the past behind them and embracing a new future together? The answer wasn't clear. In fact, it was still uncertain. The road ahead was long, and the end of their journey would bring them face to face with challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But what was already clear was that this ride was unlike any other. It wasn't just about the journey, the bikes, or the thrill of the open road. It was about something much deeper, the hope that together they could overcome the divisions that had kept them apart for so long. Stay tuned to find out what happens when these riders reach their final destination, and whether or not the unity they've found on the road will be strong enough to survive the challenges that lie ahead. Will they succeed in creating a new legacy for bikers everywhere? Or will the past prove too strong to overcome? The ride is far from over. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road as the riders pushed on, their engines roaring through the night. The air grew cooler, but the tension between them was heating up. What had begun as a simple ride to break down barriers had turned into something much more complex, something none of them had expected. The group had traveled through small towns, bustling cities, and vast, empty stretches of highway, each new landscape revealing something about themselves they hadn't known before. But the deeper they rode into unfamiliar territory, the more difficult it became to ignore the cracks in their unity. Marcus, who had been the first to agree to this ride, had started to grow distant. The laughter that once flowed freely now felt forced. His silence was deafening, and every time the group made a stop, he seemed to slip further away. It wasn't just the ride that was wearing on him. The reality of what they were doing was starting to hit him harder than he'd anticipated. For years, he had built walls around himself to survive in a world that had rejected him. And now, as these walls began to come down, the rawness of what he'd buried was beginning to surface. The question that had been plaguing his mind was simple. Could he really forgive the years of hatred, judgment, and exclusion? Could he allow himself to believe that this group of bikers, who up until now had always represented a divide, could truly become a brotherhood? Jake, too, was struggling, but in a different way. As the miles ticked by, he began to question the very foundation of his upbringing. Growing up in a world where certain lines were never crossed, he had always assumed that there were just certain people you didn't trust, certain people you didn't share things with. Now, with Marcus and the others riding beside him, the lines were beginning to blur. The barriers that had seemed so clear in his mind were dissolving before his eyes, and it scared him more than he cared to admit. Jake found himself questioning the loyalty of his own crew back home. What if they found out what was happening here on this ride? What would they think if they knew that he was not only riding with black bikers, but starting to trust them as equals? Would they see him as a traitor? The fear of rejection and judgment from his own people was heavy, but it was the fear of losing his place in the world he knew that gnawed at him most. In the midst of this, the group had faced a series of tests that had brought them closer and yet, at times, seemed to drive them further apart. A close call with a truck that nearly sent two riders off the road had tested their trust in one another, and a run-in with local law enforcement had exposed the way some towns still viewed the bikers. Black or white, they were all just troublemakers in the eyes of the law. They had fought through these moments, their unity strengthening in the face of adversity, but there was still a looming question. How long could they hold it together? One evening, as they gathered around a campfire on the side of the road, the conversation turned heavy. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, save for the occasional stir of the wind. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as he spoke. I've been thinking a lot about this ride, about what it means. We've made it this far, but what happens when we get to that final destination? Is it really going to change anything? Or are we just fooling ourselves? The group fell quiet, unsure how to respond. They'd all felt it, that nagging uncertainty that this unity they were building on the road might not last beyond the next mile, let alone the end of the ride. Jake, who had been mostly silent throughout the journey, finally spoke up. It's gotta mean something. We've come this far. We can't just throw that away, not now. Marcus looked at him, the firelight flickering in his eyes. You say that, but what happens when we go back to the real world? Will it be the same old divide, or will we really be able to see each other as brothers? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The reality of what they were doing, the emotional labor of it all, was beginning to settle in. It wasn't just about a group of bikers sharing the road for a few weeks. It was about a fundamental shift in how they saw one another. It was about breaking years of history, culture, and conditioning. Could they do it? Was it even possible? As the night grew colder, tensions rose. The air between the group felt thick, and the uncomfortable silence was broken only by the crackling fire and the distant hum of passing traffic. It was clear that the ride wasn't just about the bikes anymore. It was about something deeper, a reckoning with who they were and what they stood for. For the first time, each of them was forced to confront the reality that this ride had the potential to change everything, or to fall apart entirely. But just when it seemed like everything might unravel, something shifted. It wasn't a big moment, but rather a small, subtle gesture. Jake, his face illuminated by the fire, offered Marcus a beer. It was simple, but the gesture spoke volumes. No words were needed. It was a moment of respect, of understanding. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then took the beer, nodding in silent acknowledgement. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward. The bond they were building wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its struggles, but it was real. The ride was no longer just about the destination. It was about the process, about the moments of connection, the small acts of courage, and the willingness to face their own fears and prejudices. As they packed up the next morning, the tension was still there, but so was something else, hope. They were closer than they had ever been before, but they knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They were nearing the final leg of the journey, and soon they would face the ultimate test, the moment when their unity would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Would they make it? Would the road bring them together, or would it expose the cracks that had been growing all along? The next stop was approaching, and with it, the challenge that could either unite them for good or tear them apart forever. The last stretch of the journey loomed ahead, and with it, a sense of inevitability. The riders could feel it in the air, that silent understanding that the final destination would be a turning point. They were nearing a place that held deep significance in the biking community, a town known for its strong, storied history in the world of motorcycles. It was a place where legends had been made, but also a place where divides had always been sharp. Would they be welcomed, or would old tensions surface? As they rolled into town, the weight of their ride felt heavier than ever. People lined the streets, eyes following them with curiosity and suspicion. The town wasn't used to seeing a mixed group of bikers, black and white, riding together, and it was clear that their arrival wasn't going unnoticed. The once peaceful ride now felt like an emotional battle, each turn of the wheel bringing them closer to an uncertain confrontation. Marcus, who had been the most reserved throughout the journey, found himself at a crossroads. He had never imagined that this ride would take him here, to this place where the weight of his past could no longer be ignored. He had ridden so far, pushed through so many barriers, but now he had to face the hardest question of all. Was he truly ready to forgive everything that had happened in the past, or would the weight of the history he carried hold him back forever? Jake was in the same mental struggle. He had come so far from the rider who first agreed to join the journey, unsure of what he was getting into. Now, standing at the edge of this final moment, he was grappling with his own internal conflict. Could he stand here, side by side with Marcus and the other riders, knowing full well that back home, the world he once knew would never see things the same way again? Would they understand what he had learned on this ride, or would they turn their backs on him for daring to step outside the lines? As the group rolled into the heart of town, the tension grew palpable. The streets were filled with bikers from every corner of the country, the hum of engines filling the air. But there was something else, something unexpected, an unspoken recognition. They weren't just onlookers now. They were participants. The eyes that watched them weren't just filled with judgment. They were filled with curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, something more. Respect. It was in this moment, amidst the overwhelming uncertainty, that Marcus felt something shift inside of him. As he looked at Jake, at the other riders, and at the sea of faces around him, he realized that this ride had been more than a journey to a physical destination. It had been a journey into his own heart, into his own understanding of what it meant to truly move forward. His past, filled with anger and hurt, had shaped who he was, but it didn't have to define his future. The bikers around him weren't just symbols of a divided past. They were fellow travelers on a shared road. It was up to him to decide whether that road would end in bitterness or in hope. Jake, too, saw it clearly in that moment. He had been part of something that had the power to change everything, not just for him, but for the world around him. He had ridden with Marcus and the others, and in doing so, had seen past the labels and the stereotypes that had once seemed so real to him. There was no dividing line here. There was only the open road, the shared love of riding, and the possibility of something better. As the final act unfolded, the bikers, black and white alike, rolled up to the stage where a large rally was being held. The crowd was waiting, and the air was thick with anticipation. The moment was now. Would the unity they had built on the road survive the challenge that lay ahead? It did. As the riders took their places in front of the crowd's reaction was not one of division, but of awe. Slowly, a wave of cheers began to ripple through the crowd. The bikers, once divided by years of history and prejudice, were now seen as a unified force. In that moment, the town didn't just accept them, it celebrated them. The ride, though difficult, had proven something much greater than any of them had realized when it began. It had proven that no matter the background, the color of one's skin, or the history they carried, there was common ground in the love for the open road. There was power in choosing to see each other as human beings first, instead of being defined by the divisions that had been placed upon them. As the riders stood together, side by side, they realized that this journey wasn't about proving something to anyone else. It was about proving something to themselves. They had ridden not just for miles, but for understanding, for respect, and for the possibility of a future where unity wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. In the end, the story of this ride wasn't about the destination, but about the transformation that had taken place on the road itself. The bonds formed on the open highway would last long after the engines had cooled and the bikes were parked. It was a ride that united black and white bikers forever, not just because of the miles they traveled, but because of the hearts they opened along the way. The lesson was clear. In a world filled with division, it's possible to find unity. but it starts with understanding, with stepping outside of what's comfortable, and with choosing to see each other as more than just labels. As the riders looked out over the crowd, they knew they had done something bigger than themselves. And that in itself was the ride of a lifetime.